October 31st, 1963. Newcastle, England. 70-year-old Katherine Lillian Armstrong fails to show up for choir practice at her church. The following morning, Lillian's body is discovered near the bottom of the staircase in her house, and she has been stabbed 28 times and strangled with one of her nylon stockings. Since there are no signs of forced entry, police suspect that Lillian willingly let her killer inside, but even though a massive investigation is launched, no compelling suspects are found, and the motive for the crime remains unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and this week we're going to be traveling to the United Kingdom to cover a pair of cold cases which happened to take place on Halloween. The 1963 murder of Katherine Lillian Armstrong and the 1980 murder of Derek Grain. So as you've probably guessed after hearing the revised version of our Trail Went Cold intro music, we have now officially begun the countdown to October the 31st, and per tradition, our podcast will be spending the rest of the month covering unsolved mysteries which either took place on Halloween or have some sort of creepy Halloween slant to them. This particular episode is going to cover two murders which occurred on Halloween on opposite sides of the United Kingdom, but even if you dismiss the whole Halloween angle, there are still a number of unusual aspects of both these crimes. Katherine Lillian Armstrong was an unmarried 70-year-old retired school headmistress who lived alone in a fancy house in Newcastle, but after she failed up to show up as scheduled for a choir practice at her church on Halloween night, her body was discovered in her home the following morning. She had been stabbed 28 times and strangled with one of her nylon stockings, but there were no signs of any sexual assault or robbery. And while Lillian was known for being a rather private woman, she did not seem to have any known enemies, so no one can figure out the motive for such a brutal crime. In spite of an incredibly extensive investigation involving Scotland Yard, no potential suspects were ever found, so this crime remains just as puzzling today as it did over 60 years ago. And to add an additional wrinkle to our Halloween theme, it's been rumored that Lillian's home wound up being haunted by a restless spirit. The victim in our second case, Derek Grain, was an engineer for British Aerospace who was on secondment and temporarily residing at a hotel in Bristol when he decided to spend Halloween night drinking at a pair of local nightclubs. But after he left one of the clubs, Derek was robbed and brutally murdered, but what makes this case stand out is that he was bludgeoned with a sand-filled traffic cone, which is not the most common weapon used to kill someone. While the most logical explanation is that Derek was a random victim who was targeted by someone who simply wanted to rob him, he also happened to be heading in the opposite direction of his hotel when he left the nightclub, and there are some unusual details which have caused speculation that there might be more to this story. So in this episode, I'm going to start off by sharing the details of Lillian's murder before I provide my theories and analysis, and then I'll do the same thing with Derek's murder. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has nearly 90 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by exploring the murder of Katherine Lillian Armstrong. Our first story takes place in 1963 in Newcastle, England, which is the country's northernmost city. Our first victim is 70-year-old Katherine Lillian Armstrong, who goes by her middle name. Lillian was born in the town of Pembroke, Wales, and spent her childhood moving around and living in a number of different places in Wales and England. At one point, Lillian became engaged to a clergyman, but he died in 1918 during the Great Influenza epidemic, and she would ultimately never get married. Lillian and her parents eventually settled in Newcastle, and in 1928, they moved into a large 10-room residence called Doncaster House, located on Goldspink Lane in the Sandyford district. After Lillian pursued a career in teaching, she became the head mistress of Denton Road Junior School, and while she was known for having a very strict personality, she also showed a lot of compassion towards her students and was very well respected by them and her colleagues. After Lillian's parents passed away, she seemed content to keep living a solitary life as a spinster at Doncaster House, but even after she retired as head mistress in 1955, she remained an active member of her community, which included singing in the choir at the Central United Methodist Church. On Halloween night in 1963, Lillian was expected to appear for choir practice at the church at 7:30 p.m., but she did not show up, which seemed very out of character for her. At around 10:50 a.m. on the morning of November the 1st, Lillian's cousin, Ada Ridley, showed up at Doncaster House for a scheduled meetup with her, but was surprised to see that the curtains were still drawn, as Lillian was known for waking up early. Ada went to the front door and knocked several times, but there was no answer, and since the door was locked, Ada went to visit one of the neighbors and convinced them to phone the Northumbria police. A sergeant soon showed up at Doncaster House and forced his way inside, but was shocked to discover Lillian's body lying at the bottom of the staircase. She was wearing a dress and a pair of slippers, but one of her nylon stockings had been removed and wrapped around her neck, and she was also stabbed a total of 28 times in the face and the head. Lillian also had a number of defensive wounds, which indicated that she made an attempt to fight off her killer. Traces of blood were found on the walls in a number of different rooms, and while this seemed to suggest that the killer may have performed a search of the residence, possibly to look for valuables, nothing appeared to have been stolen. Since the front door had been locked when Ada arrived, it seemed probable that the killer escaped through the house's back door. They likely would have been covered in blood following the crime, but no one on Goldspink Lane reported seeing or hearing anything unusual that night, which led to speculation that the killer didn't have to travel very far and may have been a local resident from the area. The Northumbria police contacted Scotland Yard in London and sought the assistance of their murder squad, who traveled to Newcastle to launch a large-scale homicide investigation involving a number of experienced detectives. One of their duties involved going door to door throughout the community and interviewing thousands of local residents and providing them with specially prepared questionnaires. It turned out that the last confirmed witness to report seeing Lillian alive were a pair of kids who passed by Doncaster House at around 6:30 p.m. on October the 31st and said they saw Lillian looking out the window. Since Lillian had failed to show up for choir practice at 7:30, the murder likely took place within that 1-hour time frame. Lillian was not sexually assaulted, and the house did not appear to have been robbed, so no one could figure out a motive for the crime. But since there were no signs of forced entry, investigators believed that Lillian may have known her killer and willingly let them inside. Lillian was known for being a very private woman, so she had a rather small social circle, and no one from her personal life stood out as a potential suspect. As a result, her cousin Ada started pushing forward the theory that Lillian may have been killed by teenagers in a Halloween prank gone horribly wrong. In spite of an extensive search, the murder weapon used to stab Lillian could not be found, though there was speculation that it could have been a pair of scissors or a wooden-handled 8-inch-long bailing hook ordinarily used by longshoremen. On the evening of November the 1st, an anonymous man called Newcastle Ambulance Control and said that he was the quote-unquote Sandyford murderer, but he abruptly hung up before providing any further details, and investigators were unable to trace the call or identify this person. At one point, the authorities announced that they were looking for a quote-unquote mystery woman who was seen with Lillian and was believed to have been the last person to have spoken with her on the day she was killed. The woman was described as being in her 60s and dressed in a dark-colored coat and round-shaped hat, and was seen talking to Lillian over her garden fence. Investigators believe that Lillian may have told the mystery woman about a visitor she was expecting, but I do not believe the woman was ever tracked down or identified. The police also looked into potential connections between Lillian's murder and another similar cold case involving an elderly woman from Newcastle, which had taken place nearly 5 years earlier. The victim in question was a 71-year-old widow named Amy Browell Barrett, who ran a small shop located on Churchill Street, less than 3 miles away from Doncaster House. On the evening of February 26, 1959, Amy was found bludgeoned to death behind the counter, and the shop was also ransacked, and money was stolen from the cash register. Since the shop had been locked for hours before the discovery of Amy's body, it was estimated that the crime took place sometime between 3 and 4 p.m. that day, and the killer locked the door when they left. Amy was found with a hammer in her hand, so the theory pushed forward is that Amy may have been working in the back room when someone walked into the shop and attempted to steal money from the register. When Amy came out and caught this person in the act, she may have grabbed the hammer to defend herself, but the perpetrator proceeded to fatally attack her with a blunt instrument. The murder weapon was never found, and since the crime was never solved, investigators looked into the possibility that the same person may have been responsible for killing Lillian. However, they eventually ruled out a connection between the two crimes, though Amy's murder is also still unsolved to this day. By the time 1964 rolled around, it was reported that a team of 50 detectives had spent 18 hours per day working on Lillian's case and interviewed more than 16,000 people, but they had still failed to turn up any promising suspects or leads. As a result, the Scotland Yard murder squad eventually withdrew from the investigation and returned to London. But on April the 21st of that year, a 58-year-old college tutor named Agnes Newbigin, another spinster who lived alone, was attacked while she was inside her bathtub at a residence on Ilfracombe Avenue, located only about 4 miles from Doncaster House. Agnes claimed that a young man who appeared to be between 18 and 22 years old suddenly appeared in her bathroom and tried to attack her with a 12-inch, mid-19th century African dagger, but she managed to fight him off and take the dagger away from him before he fled the scene. Agnes believed that this man was able to access her residence because she had left the back door unlocked, but even though the police looked into potential links between this crime and Lillian's murder, they were unable to find a conclusive connection, and as far as I can tell, Agnes's attacker was never caught or identified. The investigation into Lillian's murder would grind to a dead halt, and her case pretty much faded from the spotlight, but in 1973, a woman named Joan Black moved into Doncaster House with her family. She told the press that she heard previous tenants had abruptly moved out of the house because they believed it was haunted, as they had apparently sensed a strange presence and thought they saw a ghostly figure out of the corner of their eyes near the bottom of the staircase where Lillian's body had been found. In 2014, Nigel Wilkinson, a retired Northumbria police detective with more than 30 years' experience, agreed to take a fresh look at Lillian's case and said that if enough evidence had been preserved, the crime could still conceivably be solved, as he stated, quote, "If this had happened now, we would have had a lot of new and different lines of inquiry than they had back then," end quote. Wilkinson believed it was possible that not all the blood found at Doncaster House belonged to Lillian, so if it was properly preserved, the killer's DNA could potentially be extracted from it for the purposes of forensic testing. However, I do not think this has ever taken place, and after more than 60 years, the murder of Katherine Lillian Armstrong continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I've covered a number of cold cases on this podcast which occurred several decades ago, and when I hear the details, I'll often think to myself that the crime may have been easily solved if it had taken place today. Katherine Lillian Armstrong was stabbed no less than 28 times, was strangled with one of her own nylon stockings, and she also had defensive wounds to indicate that she fought back against her attacker. There were traces of blood found in a number of rooms at Doncaster House, so like I just mentioned, Nigel Wilkinson believes there's a good chance that some of this blood might have belonged to the killer. It's also possible that traces of the perpetrator's touch DNA could have been left on the stocking or Katherine herself when she fought back, but obviously, back in 1963, DNA profiling was not a thing. And unfortunately, I have no idea how well this evidence was preserved and if the killer's DNA could be extracted from it after all this time. Unless this crime was committed by a very young person, chances are high that the perpetrator is already dead, but in North America at least, genetic genealogy has made it possible to posthumously link forensic evidence to a deceased suspect and conclusively close the books on a number of cold cases which were decades old. But unlike North America, the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe have not yet gone all in on using genetic genealogy in criminal investigations, so even if the killer's DNA can be recovered, it might be difficult to match it to anyone unless the perpetrator has been arrested and convicted of other crimes and their DNA is currently in the system. I always hate to use this expression, particularly when it's applied to an offense which seems this disorganized, but the murder of Katherine Lillian Armstrong almost appears to be the perfect crime. I mean, this is not a case where you can accuse law enforcement of performing a half-assed investigation, as they brought in some of the best detectives in the country from Scotland Yard who worked non-stop for months and interviewed over 16,000 people, yet they were unable to turn up any compelling suspects or information that shed any light on why someone would want to do this to a 70-year-old woman who did not appear to have any enemies. I previously mentioned that this case was compared to the 1959 murder of Amy Browell Barrett, another cold case involving an elderly woman over the age of 70, which took place in Newcastle and was never solved. But at least in that case, investigators were able to dream up a logical theory for why this crime took place, as it seems likely that Amy caught someone trying to steal money from the cash register in her shop. Amy had run that shop for 30 years at that point and had been robbed and burglarized no less than 20 times, so much so that her friends had advised her to close the shop for her own safety. Since Amy was found with a hammer in her hand, it's possible she just reached her breaking point and attempted to go after the person who was stealing from her, and they responded by fatally bludgeoning her. Investigators ultimately ruled out a connection between these two cases, as in spite of some similarities, the MOs do seem to be quite a bit different. We know that Amy's shop was robbed, whereas nothing appeared to be stolen from Doncaster House, but Lillian's murder just seems to defy all logic, and it's hard to dream up a reasonable theory for what happened. At the very least, it's easy to figure out a time frame for Lillian's murder, as the last confirmed sighting of her was from some kids who saw her looking out the window at around 6:30 p.m., and since Lillian did not show up for her scheduled choir practice at 7:30, it seems very likely that she was killed during that 1-hour window. Lillian's cousin, Ada Ridley, openly expressed her belief that the crime may have been a Halloween prank gone horribly wrong, as perhaps Lillian caught some teenagers entering her house, and they freaked out and attacked her. But I don't know, stabbing someone 28 times and strangling them with a nylon stocking seems pretty over the top to be the work of some dumb teenagers. I could possibly see them repeatedly stabbing her in the heat of the moment if they were panicking, but going to the trouble of removing one of Lillian's own stockings to strangle her seems pretty calculated and unnecessary, and might point to an offender who had prior experience at this sort of thing. Since there were no signs of forced entry at the residence, investigators suspected that Lillian may have known her killer and willingly let them inside. We know that the front door was locked when Ada showed up the following morning, but since the police said that the killer likely escaped out the back door, I'm assuming they found it unlocked when they arrived. But if Lillian had left the back door unlocked to begin with, could the killer have entered that way? It's possible that Lillian was a safety-conscious person who always kept her residence tightly secured, but as we're going to talk about later on, Agnes Newbigin wound up being attacked by an intruder inside her bathtub nearly 6 months later because she accidentally forgot to lock her back door, so that sort of thing does happen. Of course, given that this was Halloween night, you might wonder if Lillian opened the door for a trick-or-treater who gained access to her house. But from what I've read, even though trick-or-treating was already a popular Halloween tradition in North America in 1963, it really didn't start catching on in the United Kingdom until the late 1970s or early 1980s, so I haven't heard anything about Lillian opening her door that night to give candy to children. Since there were no reports of anyone covered in blood traveling through the neighborhood that night, I do agree with the police's assessment that the killer may have been a local resident who lived nearby. But we also know that they did door-to-door interviews and questioned thousands of Newcastle residents, so if they did cross paths with the perpetrator, they obviously didn't do anything to raise red flags and wind up on the suspect list. There is definitely still a chance that the perpetrator was someone Lillian knew, but the big questions are, who was this person and what could their motive have been? Well, Lillian was described as being a private person who had a very small social circle, but given that she was a retired school headmistress, she would have crossed paths with a lot of people throughout the course of her life. It sounds like Lillian was a stern but compassionate authority figure who was respected by her students and colleagues, but could she have been attacked by a child she once knew who held onto some personal grudge against her and then paid her a visit once they became a grown adult? I suppose it's possible, but Lillian had been retired for 8 years at that point, so I'm not sure why someone from her school days would feel compelled to kill her after all that time. While Lillian was a spinster, she had been engaged to be married at one point until she lost her fiancé to the great influenza epidemic of 1918. Since we know so little about Lillian's personal life, I don't know if she got involved in many other relationships after that, or if the loss turned out to be so devastating that it prevented her from becoming romantically involved with anyone ever again. Whatever the case, it hasn't been reported that Lillian was involved with anyone or had interest from any potential suitors at the time of her death, which could have provided a potential motive for murder, as well as the major overkill which took place. The investigation into Lillian's background was so extensive that you have to assume that if there was anyone from her personal life who had a potential reason to kill her, this would have been uncovered. All that being said, it sounds like one of the biggest unanswered questions in this case was the identity of a quote-unquote mystery woman who was supposedly seen talking to Lillian by her garden fence on the day of the crime and may have been the last person to have spoken with her. Given how much publicity this case received in Newcastle at that time, it does seem surprising that the woman was never identified. While it does not sound like investigators considered her to be a suspect, they felt that she may have had important information to share. They stated that Lillian could have told this woman about a visitor she was expecting that night, but I'm guessing this is nothing more than assumption, because unless there was a witness who clearly overheard Lillian's conversation with the woman, how could they know for certain she was expecting a visitor? Of course, if she was expecting someone, it's reasonable to assume that this visitor was the killer. What's interesting is that during the early press coverage of the investigation, the police specifically said that they had not discounted the possibility that the killer was a woman, but they later changed their mind about this and said they did not believe a woman would have had the strength to kill Lillian in such a frenzied, brutal fashion. Well, I don't know if this was just 1960s sexism talking, but women are capable of violent crimes, so unless there was specific evidence which pointed towards the perpetrator being a man, I don't think you can completely discount this idea. But since this mystery woman was described as being in her 60s, I'm not so sure she would have personally been capable of this crime. But what about the possibility that Lillian was murdered by a complete random stranger? Even if she would have been reluctant to let a stranger inside her home, that doesn't necessarily mean she couldn't have opened her door for one before she was attacked. It's been reported that Doncaster House was in close proximity to a closed-down chapel that transients would sometimes use for shelter, and there was also a nearby convent where transients showed up each morning to be given free tea and free food. And given that this was 1960s England, the word used to describe these people in the contemporary reporting was, quote-unquote, tramps. I don't know if it was common practice for Lillian to answer the door for people like this who needed food or assistance, but I suppose it's possible that she could have done so before one of these transients attacked her. However, I have to harken back to the attempted attack on Agnes Newbigin, which took place in Newcastle less than 6 months later. Agnes was an unmarried 50-year-old spinster who was nearly stabbed inside her bathtub by a young male intruder until she managed to fight him off and wrest the weapon away from him, prompting the attacker to flee the scene. There was no forced entry during the commission of this crime either, as Agnes said the intruder likely entered her home through her unlocked back door. Agnes's residence was only about 4 miles from Doncaster House, so could this mean there was a serial offender in Newcastle during this time period who liked to target older women who lived alone? And if so, did almost being caught during his attack on Agnes discourage him from attempting this again? While the murder weapon used to stab Lillian was never determined, the weapon Agnes took from her intruder was quite a unique one, as it was described as being a 12-inch mid-19th century African dagger. It was suspected that the blade which entered Lillian may have only been 8 inches long, so even if the same assailant was responsible for both these crimes, that doesn't necessarily mean he used the same weapon each time. Still, forensic science was a lot more limited back in 1964, so I would be really curious to know if this dagger is still being kept as evidence somewhere, as new testing could potentially pick up traces of the attacker's DNA. Of course, that wouldn't necessarily prove that they murdered Lillian, but at least it could turn up a potential suspect. There really is no conclusive evidence that Lillian's killer and Agnes's attacker are the same person, but given the complete lack of other promising leads in this case, I think it's as good a theory as any. I'm honestly split on whether the perpetrator was someone Lillian knew or a complete stranger who selected her at random, but even if this person is already dead, I would like law enforcement to seriously explore the possibility of performing new forensic testing on the evidence if it's available. In the meantime, if by chance you happen to have any information about the murder of Katherine Lillian Armstrong, please contact the appropriate authorities. So now let's move on to our next case. Our second story also begins in England, this time in 1980, and our second victim is 39-year-old Derek Rain. Derek hails from the market town of Hitchin and works as an engineer for British Aerospace in the nearby town of Stevenage. But for the past 2 months, Derek has been on a temporary secondment working at the British Aerospace plant in Filton, which is located over 140 miles away in the southwest portion of England and forms part of the Bristol urban area. And during his time working there, Derek has resided at the Unicorn Hotel on Prince Street in Bristol. Even though Derek is an unmarried bachelor and described as being something of a loner, he is also known for being a kind and cheerful person who is always willing to help others. At around 4 p.m. on Friday, October the 31st, Derek returned to the Unicorn Hotel from work and parked his car there. He decided to spend Halloween night drinking at a pair of nightclubs called Vicky's and Curves, which were both located on Park Street, and since they were only about a 10-minute walk from the hotel, he decided to go there on foot. At around 2 a.m. on the morning of November the 1st, Derek was seen leaving the Curves nightclub alone, but sometime within the next few hours, he would become the victim of an horrific crime. At 8 a.m. that morning, a nurse who was on her way to her shift at St. Mary's Hospital came across Derek's dead body lying face down in a pool of blood on Brandon Hill Lane, just behind Berkeley Square, which was about a quarter-mile away from Curves. The Avon and Somerset police were soon summoned to the scene, and they discovered that Derek had suffered some serious head injuries. His jacket had been torn off, and a footprint was found on the back of his blood-stained shirt, which seemed to indicate that he had been kicked in the head as he lay on the ground. While Derek had no cash on him, his bank and credit cards were scattered around his body. A blood-stained plastic traffic cone filled with sand was found about 40 yards from Derek's body. It had been used to bludgeon him and was likely taken from some roadworks which were being performed at that time at the junction of Berkeley Square and the Clifton Triangle. However, it turned out that the violent attack on Derek did not immediately kill him, as his facial injuries caused a respiratory obstruction, so his cause of death was determined to be a combination of asphyxiation and hypothermia from the cold weather. Derek left behind a mother who lived in Hitchin and was in her 80s at the time, and she was left absolutely devastated by his murder. A £500 reward was put up by 3 Park Street nightclub owners for information leading to an arrest. Based on the post-mortem examination, it was determined that Derek was likely killed sometime between 2 and 3:30 a.m. Since Derek was a very distinctive-looking individual who had a bushy black beard and no mustache, police were able to find a number of witnesses who recalled seeing him at the Vicky's and Curves nightclubs. They claimed that Derek had been carrying a roll of money and spent a lot of cash to buy drinks, which he would pay for with fresh 10-pound notes. It was estimated that between 50 to 60 pounds in cash was stolen from Derek when he was attacked, so investigators wondered if the killer or killers had noticed him carrying a large amount of money and decided to follow him, so the crime was a robbery gone wrong. A taxi driver reported seeing Eric leave Curves at 2 a.m., but curiously, he did not head down Park Street in the direction of the Unicorn Hotel, but rather in the opposite direction towards Brandon Hill Lane, where he would be found a quarter-mile away. 5 young people who had attended a witches-themed Halloween party and were walking down Park Street that morning dressed in tall witches' hats and capes eventually came forward and reported having passed by Derek outside the Bally restaurant at around 2:40 a.m. Given the violent nature of the attack, investigators believe that the perpetrator or perpetrators would have had heavy blood spatter on them, but no witnesses reported seeing anyone covered in blood in the area that morning, and while numerous dry cleaners were contacted, none of them reported having any bloody clothing dropped off of them. In the days following the murder, police announced that they were attempting to track down a young man who went by the name Albert Redding, who had recently phoned the Bristol Evening Post. Redding told them that he lived in London and had paid a visit to the Trinity Road police station in Bristol to share some information about the case. But after giving his name and address to a policeman, Redding said that he was kept waiting there for nearly an hour before he decided to leave. He then proceeded to tell the Evening Post that Derek was beaten up and possibly robbed by a gang of youths after urinating against a car. Well, an anonymous caller soon phoned the Avon and Somerset police and informed them that around 3 a.m. on November the 1st, he had seen 3 or 4 men attacking someone outside Billy Baker's Green Grocers at the Clifton Triangle, not far from the location where Derek's body was found. These men then drove off in a maroon Jaguar, and the caller even provided its registration number, KUR7G. He also expressed his belief that the attackers were from the seaside town of Weston-super-Mare, located over 20 miles southwest of Bristol. Once this information was made public, at least 6 other witnesses came forward who backed up the caller's story and confirmed having seen a fight in which 3 or 4 people attacked another individual near the Clifton Triangle during the early morning hours of November the 1st. Police came to believe that the fight originally began in Berkeley Square before the victim was chased along the Clifton Triangle and attacked. However, it does not sound like any of these witnesses were able to provide much of a description of the victim, so he could not be positively identified as Derek. Since it was not uncommon for fights to break out in that area around the time that pubs and nightclubs closed, it's possible this incident was completely unrelated to Derek's case. And while Derek often liked to go out drinking, he was not known as someone who would get himself involved in brawls. But curiously, when police performed a check on the registration number that the anonymous caller provided, they determined that it did belong to a maroon Jaguar, yet they were also able to track down the owner and confirm that he was nowhere near Bristol during the time period that Derek's murder took place. Therefore, investigators expressed their belief that the people driving the maroon Jaguar seen at the Clifton Triangle may have stolen their license plate from another similar car. But a particularly bizarre detail is that the owner of the Jaguar with this registration number lived in Reading, a city which is located 80 miles east of Bristol, and this made police suspect that the anonymous caller may have been the same young man who had previously gone by the name Albert Redding. If that wasn't an interesting enough coincidence, the Jaguar had also been originally registered in Hitchin, which happened to be Derek's hometown. Police did send out a public plea for the caller to come forward again to confirm more details, but he never did. There were also reports of a quote-unquote foreign-looking man who may have been Iranian and was seen running across Queen's Road in Bristol and cutting in front of a car being driven by a female motorist around the approximate time of Derek's murder. But this man was never tracked down or identified, and it's unclear if he has any connection to the case. The investigation pretty much reached a standstill, though in 2009, it was announced that a forensic analysis was going to be performed on the traffic cone as well as the insides of Derek's pockets to see if they contained skin cells or traces of DNA belonging to his killer. However, it sounds like this analysis failed to turn up any conclusive evidence which allowed the authorities to link the crime to a suspect, so after 45 years, the murder of Derek Grain continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you can say, the trail went cold. So like I mentioned in the intro, this might be the only case I've seen in which a plastic traffic cone was used as a potential murder weapon, and while they would ordinarily not be heavy enough to seriously injure someone, it sounds like this cone had an additional amount of weight because it was filled with sand. However, it's worth noting that it does not sound like being struck with the traffic cone and being kicked in the head was enough to kill Derek Grain on its own, as his official cause of death was listed as a combination of asphyxiation and hypothermia. The crime was believed to have taken place between 2 and 3:30 a.m., but Derek's body was not discovered until 8 a.m., so who knows how long it took for him to die. But this delay could also be taken as a sign that even though someone brutally beat Derek, it may not have been their intention to actually kill him. On the one hand, this does appear to be a rather uncomplicated crime, as we know that Derek had money stolen from him, so it's possible he was simply the victim of a robbery gone wrong by one or more individuals who were complete strangers to him. But on the other hand, there's some very odd details which bother me, such as the reported sighting of a maroon Jaguar which just happened to be registered from Derek's hometown. Much like Katherine Lillian Armstrong, Derek Grain was described as someone who seemed content to be a private, unmarried person, but was still friendly with the people he did interact with, and did not seem like someone who would be the target of such a brutal crime. If you've seen photographs of Derek, he's a very distinctive-looking person, and this is why police were able to speak with a number of witnesses who remembered seeing him and interacting with him while he spent Halloween night drinking at the Vicky's and Curves nightclubs. But what investigators found frustrating was the lack of sightings of Derek after he left these clubs, and if you look through the newspaper archives, you'll find a number of articles about this case in which the police described the public's lack of response to their appeals for information to be quote-unquote shameful. I mean, I know this was after 2 a.m., but it was also Halloween on a Friday night/Saturday morning in an area which had a number of pubs and nightclubs, so it still would have been fairly busy at that hour. Given the brutal nature of Derek's murder, police were also surprised by the lack of eyewitness sightings of anyone who had blood spatter on them, but how do we know that some witnesses did see this and just wrote it off as a Halloween costume or a prank? It appears that the only reported sightings of Derek after he left Curves were from a group of people in witches' costumes who said they passed by him on Park Street at 2:40 a.m. And while we have numerous sightings of a fight taking place near the Clifton Triangle, in which someone was apparently attacked by 3 or 4 people, it's never been conclusively established if this incident involved Derek. Of course, the witnesses who saw Derek in the nightclubs said that he was carrying a large roll of cash and was using fresh $10 notes to pay for drinks, so it's not hard to imagine someone else from the club setting their eyes on Derek and deciding he would be the ideal target for a robbery. But even so, why attack him in such a brutal fashion? I haven't heard any reports of Derek having defensive wounds on his body, so if he was robbed, it does not sound like he attempted to put up much of a fight. And if you believe the robbery theory, that still doesn't account for some of the discrepancies in the timeline. When Derek left Curves, he was seen heading down Park Street in the opposite direction away from the hotel where he was staying. We know Derek had been drinking and was described as being fairly intoxicated, so it's possible that this is the reason he headed in the wrong direction. It could also be chalked up to the fact that he did not live in Bristol and had only been there on secondment for 2 months, so he may not have known the neighborhood that well. Hell, if he was feeling a major buzz, perhaps Derek didn't even want to go back to the hotel at that point and got this compulsion to explore the city, as people can make strange decisions when they're drunk. Now, the distance from Curves to the murder scene on Brandon Hill Lane was about a quarter mile, but he left the club at around 2 a.m., and passed by the people in the witches' costumes on Park Street at 2:40, and it should not have taken him 40 minutes to travel that distance. But once again, if he was inebriated, how do we know that Derek simply didn't get lost or decide to go exploring? But how does this altercation where Derek was supposedly beat up by 3 or 4 people at 3 a.m. fit into the timeline? Since it was corroborated by a number of different witnesses, I have no doubt that this fight actually did happen, but was it related to Derek's case? Well, the issue is that this attack took place near the Clifton Triangle, and Derek was found on Brandon Hill Lane behind Berkeley Square, and when you look at the geography, it still would have been at least a 3 or 4 minute walk from the Clifton Triangle to the spot where Derek's body was found. It's been reported that after the attackers completed their assault, they fled the scene in a maroon Jaguar, so if Derek was beaten up at that spot, does this mean that he made his own way to Brandon Hill Lane, and these people tracked him down and attacked him again until he was dead? It's been reported that the traffic cone may have been taken from some roadworks at the junction of the Clifton Triangle and Berkeley Square. None of the witnesses to this fight reported that any of the attackers were using a traffic cone, so I guess it's possible that the owners of the Jaguar could have grabbed the cone and brought it with them when they went after Derek again. Well, the first person who brought this altercation to the police's attention was an anonymous caller who never actually had a face-to-face meeting with them. But it's suspected that he also happened to be the anonymous informant named Albert Redding, who had been in contact with the Bristol Evening Post. I'm pretty certain that wasn't actually his real name, but it's pretty troubling that when the anonymous caller provided a registration number for this maroon Jaguar, it turned out that the vehicle's owner lived in the city of Reading. So either this is one of the most extraordinary coincidences of all time, or the informant who called the Evening Post was doing some serious trolling when he came up with this fake name. Or alternatively, they wanted to provide some important information without giving away their identity. Police ultimately concluded that the owner of the Jaguar wasn't anywhere near Bristol on the night of the murder, and in the contemporary media coverage, he was referred to as a quote-unquote respectable man. The police also concluded that the drivers of this Jaguar may have stolen the license plate from the Jaguar owner in Reading, but if the anonymous caller who provided the registration number was the informant calling himself Albert Redding, something just doesn't add up here, and I have to think that there's a piece of this puzzle missing. Well, in December of 2017, a write-up about this case was made by Paul Sutherland, host of the True Crime Enthusiast podcast, and a few years later, a very odd comment was left underneath it by a poster under the username No, who directly accused another individual of being responsible for Derek's murder. For obvious reasons, I'm not going to repeat this individual's name here, but the poster alleged that this person was from Stevenage, which is where Derek had been employed by British Aerospace before he went on secondment. The poster alleged that multiple people were involved in Derek's murder, and it had something to do with the lead perpetrator having been abused by Derek and wanting to get revenge. This person reportedly lured Derek somewhere and gave Derek the false impression that if he paid him, he would keep his mouth shut about this alleged abuse, and this could explain why Derek was carrying such a large amount of cash. But instead, this individual and his accomplices fatally beat Derek and stole his money, and this maroon Jaguar also apparently belonged to the perpetrator's brother. Now, you obviously have to take an anonymous internet comment with a huge grain of salt, but if that last part is true, and the killer borrowed his brother's Jaguar in order to travel to Bristol to commit this crime, it could explain why police were able to rule out the Jaguar's owner of any direct involvement, and this theory does make more sense than the vehicle's license plates being stolen. It also provides a potential explanation for why Derek headed in the opposite direction of the hotel and traveled towards Brandon Hill Lane after he left the nightclub, but it still seems pretty wild that these people would travel over 140 miles to lure Derek to a public place at 3 a.m. in order to beat him and rob him. And if Derek knew about this planned meetup, why would he spend all those hours drinking at these nightclubs and getting intoxicated, which would cause him to let his guard down and potentially become more vulnerable to these attackers? Yes, I have to concede that these allegations do help explain some of the odd discrepancies with the Jaguar, and perhaps the mysterious Albert Redding was someone who developed a conscience over the whole situation and wanted to provide the police with some information without coming out into the open. But until law enforcement publicly acknowledges and comments on this whole angle, I will retain some healthy skepticism and lean towards the simpler theory that Derek was the victim of a robbery gone wrong by one or more complete strangers who simply wanted to steal his money. Regardless of what the motive was, I still think there's a good chance that multiple people were involved in this crime, and unfortunately, they have managed to elude justice for 45 years. So if by chance you happen to have any information about the murder of Derek Grain, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened in either of today's featured cases, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 90 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the bizarre and baffling 2001 murder of real estate agent Mike Emmert, which is technically considered to be solved, but still has a bunch of unanswered questions. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 2001 disappearance and murder of Margie Dabney, an elderly woman who somehow went missing from an airport. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 80 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Megan O. and David G. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode, and as you probably noticed, we're going to be spending the rest of the month playing his special Halloween-themed version of the Trail Went Cold theme. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. Anyway, for our last 2 episodes in October, we're going to be counting down to Halloween by covering a pair of unusual mysteries which have a very creepy slant to them, and next week, we will once again be returning to the United Kingdom. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for our next special Halloween-themed episode of The Trail Went Cold.